Hi, David.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm all right, thank you.
Well, good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You're David Frum, known to probably almost everyone who's watching or listening, and possibly known in particular for writing this cover story for The Atlantic called How to Build an Autocracy, in which you paint a disturbing picture of the prospects that we face in the form of Donald Trump. Anything else you say by way of introduction? I mean, you were, what, a senior editor at The Atlantic?
I'm a senior editor. Senior in the sense of senile, not senior in the sense of important. And I am coming to the end of this credit, but I am chairman of the think tank in the UK Policy Exchange, although my term is coming to an end in April.
Mm-hmm. And you're not as illuminated as brightly as I am, and that's intentional to keep the Trump hordes from being able to recognize you? Is that right?
No, that's because you're a member of the Illuminati.
And also, well, okay, I'll go with that interpretation. So, you know, my wife read this and was slightly freaked out. I tried to reassure her. But, you know, you make the case that things could get kind of dark. What is your, what are the basic bullet points for, like, how he could move us toward a kind of autocracy, toward a more authoritarian country?
Well, the first thing that is necessary to understand is what I'm not saying. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of loose fascist Hitler analogies being thrown about, and we know a lot about the move toward more authoritarian systems in the 21st century, and what happens in the world in 2010 is not what happened in the world in 1935. History doesn't repeat itself. I had a great teacher in college who said, history only seems to repeat itself to those who don't pay attention to details. But it's not even that. There are a lot of bad stops on the tram line before you reach Hitler Station. And you don't need to reach that. And the analogy I keep pointing to is Hungary, a member state of the European Union, a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights, a country that is now moved from fully free to semi-free, and yet in the past half dozen years, there's not a single person who's been wrongfully arrested in Hungary. And of course, no one's been killed. You can undermine freedom of the press, you can undermine the rule of law without creating a full-blown mid-1930s totalitarian ideological state. This is not an ideological age. The other thing that I think that is sort of the thing I had spent a lot of time thinking about is Americans are very complacent about the checks and balances in their system. The checks and balances are metaphors, not mechanisms. It's just people. And if people don't act, then there are a lot of possibilities, and that's what the article is about. It goes through the weakness of congressional oversight, the weakness of the internal checks in the federal bureaucracy, and the weaknesses in public opinion. One of the things that makes very clear is, I think the courts are going to be robust for a long time to come. I don't have any doubts about that. But it's pretty easy to stay out of court.
Right. Now, speaking of courts, we might as well start with a topical issue. As we tape this, and this will be posted tomorrow, but as we tape this ruling has come down against Trump on the travel ban executive order. So I guess this is going to the Supreme Court, right? And this is interesting. I mean, is this a sign of hope in the sense that if you looked at this case on the merits, not that I'm a lawyer, but what little I've looked into it suggests that it's not at all obvious that Trump would lose on the merits. The immigration legislation gives the president very broad authority. And yet he's run into now pretty sustained resistance in the judiciary. And this, of course, the judiciary is one of the really pretty substantial, I would say, almost not merely metaphorical, right? I mean, unless he out and out says, I'm not going to follow a judicial ruling, which would be a true constitutional crisis, judges can tell him to do stuff, and so far they are, and since it's not so clear that he loses on the merits, is this itself a sign that the judiciary is showing, signs of alarm about this guy?
Yes and no. I mean, it's also a sign of accelerating crisis. Look, Trump should have won this case on the merits. He really should have. The court should have deferred to the president's judgment. So why did he lose? Well, we'll know more. But here's my suspicion, that the president's lawyer said you have to give deference to the president's determinations in matters of national security. And that's what the statute calls for. And the court says, yeah, normally we do that. But if you submit us a brief full of like spelling errors and amateurish mistakes, and if you're saying we're excluding people from Muslim countries that begin with the letter I and have 2 syllables, Indonesia, which has more Muslims and more terrorists, is not included because it has too many syllables. I mean, if the whole thing is a totally half-assed proposition, then we're not going to defer because we don't believe the president has made a determination. We think he just, took out a piece of paper that somebody found in the drawer from the Obama administration, scribbled out the headline, and wrote a new headline on top. But that, I think, is pointing us on the way to, I think the courts here may be in the wrong. And it's a sign of the accelerating crisis that we're going to face, that the anti-Trump or the non-Trump elements in the society are going to try to find footings where they're kind of also departing from some important traditions. You talked to Mickey Kaus about Rosa Brooks. And I think she phrased this in a slightly more inflammatory way than was advisable. But her point is...
She wrote this piece on foreign policy and wound up with the Trump hordes after her online, which is a phenomenon you talk about in your piece. But go ahead, fill in the blanks.
Which is, if the president makes a reckless but lawful order, it's a huge problem if the military obeys it. It's a huge problem if the military doesn't obey it. And it's hard to say which of those things is worse.
Right. And then, Rosa was beset upon by the hordes. So are you saying on this, and I want to talk about that as a phenomenon, because one interesting point you make is it won't be exactly like, it won't be thugs beating people up. It'll be more like online harassment, but it will have much the same effect that it has in the classic incipient authoritarian state. So, but let's finish the court.
No one's going to send militiamen. No one's going to send militiamen to jostle pedestrians off the sidewalk in a society where people don't walk on the sidewalk in the first place.
That is probably true. Although it would not surprise me if, given the number of anti-Trump demonstrations we're going to see, it would not surprise me if you see an encounter with, bikers for Trump or whatever they're called that does get out of hand. That wouldn't surprise me at all.
But this is one of the key points in the piece, is understand, and this is one of the things because your audience, as I understand it, tilts a little to the left.
Judging by the comments section, you are completely wrong, but go ahead.
That people need to, that these protests are not a problem for Trump. They're a resource. Because one of the things that Trump brings to this project that he's got is polarization. The more he can polarize society, the fact is, there are a lot of pretty conservative people who are uncomfortable with Donald Trump. But they are more uncomfortable with other things. So Trump's project is, he needs to eliminate middling alternatives to him. He needs to say it's the people throwing Molotov cocktails on the Berkeley campus or me. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things, and you see this, and this is one of the things that's been very disturbing to me in the past few days, one of the things that really confirms a lot of my anxieties. This incident at Berkeley with Milo Yiannopoulos. So Milo, I'm sure everyone knows this, he's a right-wing provocateur, and he goes to campuses and he tries to cause trouble, and the Berkeley police tried to protect his right to speak, and then these armed paramilitaries in black masks with crowbars showed up, and they defeated the Berkeley police, and so the university surrendered to the situation and blocked the talk, not because it wanted to block the talk, and not because, but they were overwhelmed by the heckler's veto. But the way this is written about by respectable people like the Wall Street Journal is it's as if Berkeley University itself, rather than surrendering to violence, and maybe they should have called the state troopers, I don't know, but rather than surrendering to violence, having declared they were going to protect the guy's right to speak, that Berkeley was involved, is somehow complicit with the blast mask crowbar wielders. And that's the Trump playbook. You want to make sure the choice is Milo or it's guys in black masks and crowbars. Because, and this is the one way that modern authoritarianism is continuous with what happened in the 1950s and 1930s. When in a property-owning democracy, you can confront people with a choice between right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing anarchy, right-wing authoritarianism will win.
Right. Now, I will say that by and large, looking at all the protests there have been, including the Women's March and then the spontaneous travel ban marches and so on balance, people have been remarkably well behaved.
Well, the Women's March in Washington in particular was amazing. 500,000 people, not a single arrest. And, that means like nobody threw like a McDonald's wrapper on the floor of the subway. So that's an amazing testament to the discipline. I had to be out of town that day. I was there, but I had many friends who were there who reported it was a really happy and easygoing crowd with not a lot of anger and rancor. And although, it's not a good idea to invite narcissistic pop stars to address your rally because they're going to be narcissistic pop stars. That was a success. But those things are resources to President Trump that the job of polarization is something he's going to want to do. And people who are engaged in various forms of protest need to be super strategic about how they do it, which is not something that comes naturally to left liberals. I speak here as someone who's not like, this is not my first language. This is not my culture, but I speak as a kind of outside observer. There are a lot of things here that don't work quite so well.
Okay, well, lay down some guidance here. I mean, I assume for starters, don't be violent. But does your guidance go beyond that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So first, why are you having the protest? You're having the protest not because the protest is going to change anything. The protest is going to energize people to go back home and do the actual work. Big marches are about energizing your supporters, and they're about introducing people to new friends whom they otherwise wouldn't meet.
One asterisk, I think a value of the travel ban demonstrations was to show the world, including Muslims around the world, that they should not draw too many inferences about American opinion based on what Trump does. But with that interjection, I'd say basically, yes, I agree with you about the functions of protest.
Meetings change. Protests are only valuable to the extent that they set up meetings. It's meetings that change the world. Meetings are dreary, tedious, and I think we become a disaffiliated society. And Trump is a product of that disaffiliated society. And if you're going to contain him, you have to become a reaffiliated society. And that means town halls, PTA meetings. President Obama said something in his farewell address that I thought was very powerful, which is we spend too much time engaging with people in virtual space and not enough engaging with our actual physical space neighbors in real space. That was a profoundly true point. Because you will never be as rude to a neighbor as you will be to somebody on the internet, no matter how much you dislike the neighbor.
No, that's true. And in fact, even a face-to-face conversation on Blogging Heads, we have found, is way less inflammatory than two people writing about each other. So you're saying, like, show up at town hall meeting, like, send letters to your you're talking about all kinds of participatory democracy, basically, in a very disciplined and courteous way.
And when you go to one of these rallies, take people's names and addresses and and keep in touch with them and meet with them in real space. It's an interesting thing that the most conservative group in America, the Mormons, was also the most resistant to Trump because they are the most interconnected community in America. And just the fact that they go to each other's homes and have real human connections meant that when somebody came along with this message of resentment and anger, it just didn't align with the world as they knew it. That they knew a more human and happier world, and that's something you need to build. The next thing I would say is you need to expend at these protests unlimited energy on behalf of highly limited goals. One of the things that was really wrong from my point of view with the Women's March was they had 90 goals, and not only they had 90 goals, but they had a whole list of people who weren't welcome. And in particular, there's this flare-up about women who are anti-abortion. So if you tell me you don't want anti-abortion, you're a pro-choice woman and you don't want anti-abortion women there, you're telling me that the abortion issue remains for you issue number one and Donald Trump is issue number two. And then with that action, you've destroyed the whole point of the march. If this is a unique moment in American life, look, if your child is hit by a car, you're going to take help from any doctor, no matter how much you dislike that doctor's point of view on a whole range of issues. Doctor can save your child, you'll accept the doctor's help. So if this is really that degree of severity, then the fact that you don't agree on abortion, you don't agree on guns, you don't agree on gays, you don't agree on capital gains tax rates, none of those things are going to matter. What matters is protecting the rules that allow you tomorrow to knock the shit out of each other on taxes and abortion and gays and guns and all those other normal issues.
And was it clear that the anti-abortion marchers or would-be anti-abortion marchers were anti-Trumpers? I mean, they weren't just kind of showing up and saying, well, if this is a woman's march, I'm surely,
Okay, fair enough. If that were my impression was...
I don't know. I don't know the answer.
That there are women who said, I really regard him as a threat, but I'm pro-life, and I want to be there, and I want to be there in my capacity as a pro-life woman. I think that would be, by the way, if I were organizing a march and you had such, that would be fantastic. During the election, I had a joke about my wife and I were going to arrange a super PAC called "Deranged Hillary Haters for Hillary," and in some way, that like having people who really like Hillary voting for Hillary, that's sort of expected. Deranged Hillary hate. I mean, yeah, we did think she murdered Vince Foster. Nonetheless,
yeah.
I don't think she did.
Mickey Kaus, who you mentioned, I think, was claimed to be affiliated with something he started called "Kerry Haters for Kerry" in a previous election. But
that's a powerful slogan. But although he probably wasn't really for Kerry. But
well, we have suspicions now, don't we? Now that he's come out for Trump.
Yeah. Someday I've had this talk that someday Mickey and I have to do. A conversation about how he ended up to my right flank. I grew up doing all of my driving with Mickey, knowing that Mickey was on my left flank, and suddenly there he is over here, and I can no longer find my way around town.
It's yes, I encourage that conversation, and you've had one with him that was good some months ago about Trump, and you can have another one on this platform if you want. So, okay, so there's some rules. What about the Well, are there any other messages for demonstrators? That's pretty clear guidance, I think. Reach broadly, focus narrowly.
I say, if one more thing I say, and look, I don't want to tell people what kind of politics they should have. I mean, the Democratic Party remains open for business. If your top issue is Dodd-Frank or preserving the Affordable Care Act, then go ahead, just be an ordinary Democrat. But if you're trying to put together a broad, as Ben Wittes calls it, coalition of all democratic forces, then you need to work with people who disagree with you on all kinds of things you really care about, and you have to subordinate those issues. And think of it like the doctor who's saving your kid in a car crash. You disagree about all kinds of things, and the way I think about this, because ironically, I agree with Donald Trump, or at least the purported Donald Trump, on many of his issue stances. I'm an immigration restrictionist. I'm a little less enthusiastic about trade than I used to be, and I do think we need a more middle class, populist kind of Republican Party.
He's being hostile toward Iran. You got to like that, right?
I kind of like that, yeah. So it's like the joke about the Plotkin diamond, which is this magical diamond that comes only, however, with this one tragic curse, and the curse is Mr. Plotkin. I just don't think this is a fit person to be president of the United States. I think he's dangerous, not just because he's a bad president, but he's dangerous to the institutions of American government. And so I'm prepared to give up a lot of things I care about a lot in order to preserve things I care about the most. So I don't think it's unreasonable for me to say to all those, you just are going to have to work with your brother-in-law who listens to Rush Limbaugh on keeping the Russians out of American politics.
I actually have a brother-in-law like that. Go ahead.
Brother-in-law like that. I used to be a brother-in-law like that. But on the issues of making sure that American presidents are elected by Americans, and making sure that American presidents do not engage in crooked financial transactions on gigantic multi-billion-dollar scales. I think many people who disagree on what the capital gains tax rate should be able to agree on those things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like going down your list of kind of things to be alarmed by. Well, actually, no. Let's stay on this court case for just a second, because one theme that emerges from your piece is the sense, I don't know how explicit you are about this, but the sense that in a way he can't lose. Because polarization is his friend, because any sign of resistance, except the most skillfully implemented, is his friend. He kind of can't lose. So you take this court case, and either he wins and he is the Uberman, or he loses, and that's just more evidence that even the courts are stacked against him, and he is setting it up so that they will be blamed for future terrorism, right? So there is this. That's the scariest thing. Is if you become convinced that basically the guy can't lose here.
I don't attribute it to him magical properties. I don't think Donald Trump is a strategic thinker at all. He's an impulsive thinker with a lot of shrewd self-preservation. So his habit is he gets into trouble because of his incompetence. But when he's in trouble is when he's most skillful. And that's, by the way, how he's going to be most dangerous, because I don't think he's out here to build an authoritarian state. I think he's out here to make himself one of the richest men in the world. His problem is that the American system frowns on its president using his office for massive individual self-enrichment, and so that's going to put him on the wrong side of the law or ethics rules in all kinds of ways, and he's going to need to shut down those systems, not as an end in itself. That's not what he's trying to do. He's not ideological. He's trying to get rich.
That's my view.
He's trying to get rich in a system that is hostile to the president getting rich, and so he has to destroy the system in order to get rich.
Yeah, I mean, I said my view is that he's not ideological, although Mickey and others have come up with some counter evidence that there's some continuity in his views over time. But I view him as fundamentally not ideological. I view the ideology as coming from Bannon and people like that, and just what has worked for him. But I don't agree that the driving motivation is to get richer per se. I think more important to him on a day-to-day basis is A, getting attention, and B, ideally approval. Although I almost think sometimes he'd rather have unfavorable attention than no attention. But what he'd like is favorable attention. And that's almost, one feature of our democracy as it has evolved and technology has evolved over time is faster and faster feedback cycles in terms of politicians like getting feedback from their constituents on what they're doing. Well, this is the fastest ever because this guy is just waking up and like, what are they saying at this moment on cable TV about me? How can I change that? Or are they not, worse still, are they not talking about me at all? How can I change it? I think the more worrying than his, financial self-aggrandizement is the sheer desperate addiction to attention and deep-seated desire for approval.
Look, I don't want to go too much inside his head because how can we go? Let me put it this way. If your motive is the desire for approval, that's actually a pretty wholesome motive. That in the right way. I mean, George Washington was motivated by approval. So he was constantly thinking, yes, I have an opportunity here to become a military dictator. Or I have the opportunity to have people who will be born 200 years from now thinking I'm the greatest American ever. And that Washington's need for approval led him to be restrained and disciplined and to do consistently good actions. And that's true for a lot of us. And why do people give to charity? Because they want their name to. There are some people who give anonymously, but most people give for the plaque. And God bless them. That's why we have plaques. You really did help those disabled children or, preserve that beautiful work of art. And you got a little credit. You deserve it, and good for you. The problem with Donald Trump is the particular kind of approval he needs comes from approval through the humiliation of others. That he's never been interested in approval because there is no Trump hospital for disabled children. There is no Trump wing at the Metropolitan Museum. First, he couldn't afford it because he's basically a deadbeat. But even if he had been able to afford it, he wouldn't have done those things. What he wants to see is the Trump mountain of skulls of defeated opponents. And that need is really a sinister need. But I keep insisting this is how I end the article. This is not about him. So these questions of who is he, what is he a fascist, when they're interesting, they're not important. The question is who are we? And are we going to have the civilizational resources to contain this challenge? And one of my observations about America, a lot of the inherited social and moral capital of American democracy has been depleted. We're not the joiners that we used to be. We're not the participants we used to be. That's where Donald Trump comes from.
Okay. Yeah, so let's move on to get back to what form the resistance can productively take. I mean, my last point on that is, I before we do that, I do think it matters. I do think kind of, assessing what's going on in his brain matters in the sense that if he is driven just by desperate need for attention, that may have tactical implications for us. And I agree with you that, again, approval isn't foremost in his mind, but I think maintaining attention is. And I agree that for whatever reason, he's gotten himself into a situation where the form of attention / approval is that first and foremost he's got to maintain this base, and the base he's got likes him lashing out at people. I also think it's his instinct. In fact, I think in a way the reason we have him is there's an uncanny meshing of his weird temperament with this moment in history. Yeah. But for whatever reason, a guy who does instinctively lash out at all critics has now come to see that as an effective weapon in maintaining what he feels he has to maintain, which is this 40% approval, which to me is a troublingly high figure. I mean, people say, well, the polls are moving against him. No, actually, the percentage who disapprove has risen since his presidency started, but the approval seems to be bedrock. It's like 41, 42% in that CNN poll, and I think he's going to maintain that resource at all costs. So anyway, that's my last sermon on the nature of Trump, unless you want to add anything before we get back to what we can do about it.
One of the things I find helpful in understanding politics is sports. In this sense, I am a non-sport. I'm a profound non-sports fan. I never watch any sporting events. I'm not interested. I usually, like 2 days out from the Super Bowl, I know who's in it, and I may, thanks to my son, know the name of one of the quarterbacks. But other than that, it's just a blur to me. And for a lot of people, whenever I think about politics, I think most people think about politics the way I think about football. And so you can get overexcited about Donald Trump's 40% base of support. I think most of those people are ordinary Americans who do disapprove of mocking people with hereditary, disabilities. That clip of that Trump mocking the reporter is the consistently most powerful. People hate that. They really hate that.
A lot of them have been convinced that it's kind of that he wasn't really doing that. But anyway, go ahead.
But the reason they are convinced, I mean, that's obviously a ludicrous thing to say. I know I have many of my friends who will tell me that. But I think that's a sign of health. That the number of people say, yeah, God damn it, the thing he did on that tape, he did it, God bless. No, they need to come up with, and the very implausibility of the lie you have to hold on to believe it shows how abhorrent the behavior is. Mm-hmm. Because people won't, guy was fucking asking for it, and it was hilarious, actually, mocking people whose arms don't work. Hilarious. But people don't say that. I think many of those 40% they're very vague on the difference between Donald Trump and Mitt Romney. Very vague on it. And they know and they know that the people who didn't like Mitt Romney seem not to like Donald Trump, and that's really enough for their 9 minutes a day of political thought. And I don't say that in any kind of condescending way, because that's healthy. It's kind of psychically healthy, and in a well-functioning state, you shouldn't have to think that much about democracy and politics. The problem is we're not right now a well-functioning state, and we need to mobilize people to think more about it than if we were working better than we'd have to.
Right. My main point is just that the things over the last 3 weeks that so many elites have taken as signs that, as things that should work to his disadvantage. I mean, there's the travel ban, there's his various things he said on Twitter and so on, and disaster after disaster. I'm just saying, hasn't touched his baseline of support. And that's something we have to reckon with, is that there's not going to be a mass freaking out at things that freak us out.
But here's what he also has to reckon with. So I was talking to, I have many friends in Trump world, and I was talking to a pro-Trump friend of mine after the Women's March on Washington. And he was saying very dismissively, I just noticed how there are very few minorities, there are very few whites, there's just a lot of middle-aged women from affluent suburbs who seem to be there, and we don't need them. So middle-aged women from affluent suburbs, are they good at organizing things? Yeah, kinda. I actually, those are very, very dangerous opponents to have. And the elite, the non-elite basis of Trump's support is why it's resistant to information. But the non-elite basis of Trump's support is why, this is the hope, is it's not, in a crisis, it's not there for him, because his opponents are going to be more networked and active. Mm-hmm. What he has, and this is the real resource, and this is the place, the focus, the thing that worries me most is not his grip on his supporters, it is his grip on the state. That is the most important asset he has. He has the state, and he has a state that has been so well run for so long that I worry it has lost some of its ability to distinguish improper from proper orders.
Yeah, especially given that he's got a Republican Congress to work with. I mean, there are things he would have trouble. I mean, for example, just the selection of deputies, not only the heads of each department, but the deputies, which is still being done. That's Congress has some say over that, but that's pretty much irrelevant now.
Well, it's not just Congress, but a highly ideological Congress. I make this point a lot, and so forgive me if you've heard it before, but what normally happens between presidents and Congress is a new president comes in with a big agenda, things he wants to do, and then he discovers a Congress with his own party full of people with a lot of human frailties. And this person is not the most financially honest person in the world, and this person has some drinking problems, and this one isn't a great husband and father. And the president, in order to achieve his agenda, must work through these very imperfect creatures. In this case, it's quite the opposite. Paul Ryan is the person with the big agenda, highly ideological. You could call him idealistic. And I think you should. I think it's sort of clarifying to do that. And he's got a majority. He can pass the things he's always wanted to pass. Republicans have won the popular vote in one of the past 7 elections. He needs Trump's signature. And this time it is the Speaker of the House who's in the presidential role, and the president who's like a member of Congress with a lot of human frailties. And so Ryan needs to manage Trump in a way that a president usually needs to manage Congress. But where this analogy breaks down is he's the president. And managing the things he wants are not just some bridge somewhere or someone to look the other way as he puts his girlfriend on the public payroll. What he wants is real wealth, real power.
Right, and so you don't see Congress as a likely source of resistance. Do you take any heart in things like McCain, Lindsey Graham saying the occasional critical thing about something Trump has done, or more recently the House Oversight Committee, the head of the House Oversight Committee called for the reprimand of Kellyanne Conway for being Ivanka's huckster.
I have 2 tests. Remember, I talked about economy and demands. There are 2 things I want. If I get these 2 things, I'm reassured. If I don't get them, I'm scared. I want a law requiring the Secretary of the Treasury to release the tax returns of any major party nominee for president and the sitting president and vice president. I want that to be a matter of law, and it's totally constitutional to do that. And the second thing I want is an independent commission into Russian involvement in the 2016 election, headed by distinguished Americans of the 2 parties, with an executive director with a deep intelligence background and with subpoena power. If I get those 2 things, I calm down. If I don't, I stay alarmed.
So not because those things are so important in themselves, but because they are litmus tests of whether there will be true resistance.
Well, no, they're important in themselves. And this is where I'm going to get off your...
But I mean, the income taxes don't help us over the next 4 years, for example.
Yes, they do. Because the particular nature of Donald Trump's, I fear, I don't allege because I don't know, but I fear deeply corrupt global business dealings. They're not going to be caught by I filled out that disclosure form for federal employees. It's not going to capture what I fear Donald Trump is up to. But because he carries his activities through a set network of real estate partnerships, and because he wants to go on using that $1 billion worth of tax losses he ran up for himself, and he has to run his income through his personal tax return in order to have the advantage of those tax losses. So that's where the truth will be. If there's kleptocracy, it's in those returns. And the Russia thing, for me, that's only issue 1. That's issue 1 through 5. And if I thought Donald Trump were a completely domestic demagogue, then I would start paying attention to those questions about who are his supporters and what do they want. But I don't see him as a purely domestic phenomenon, and I don't see him as he's an expression in the United States of a global problem that is we're now going to see in the next French presidential election of this newly energized Putinist international that is able to weaponize social media. It's not like Russia's a country with a GDP of the size of Italy. I must not get carried away about them. But they've found some techniques that at least for the moment, we don't have good responses to. And they're using that to wreck the Western alliance and to tear apart the European Union.
Yeah, although by the same token, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of people are looking for the sinister form of influence that Russia has over Trump. I mean, there's a natural ideological alignment here. He's an ethno-nationalist, as is Marine Le Pen. I mean, there is a naturally emerging coalition, international network of ethno-nationalist leaders and aspiring leaders. And it makes perfect sense ideologically, if you take his ideology seriously, for him to sign up with those people and try to wreck the European Union.
But, ethno-nationalists don't have the reason ethno-nationalism went out of style after 1945 is that ethno-nationalists tend not to play well together. I mean, you might say, hey, you're a Serbian ethno-nationalist.
It is ironic that there's a global network of people who hate globalism, yes.
We have a lot in common. Yeah, what we have in common is you hate Croats and I hate Serbs, buddy.
Right.
And it doesn't work. It's not a sustainable. Well,
yeah, but I mean, they see that fundamentally they are either Christian or Judeo-Christian, however you want to read it, and Caucasian. So they see themselves as the same ethno-tribe.
That's not going to hold up. Look, French people and German people do have a lot in common. And yet they've managed to have some unpleasant encounters between themselves.
Okay. So you also are concerned about, and by the way, quickly on the government thing, the most troubling thing in your article that I had not thought about was that the president, so he can fire any U.S. attorney and replace U.S. attorney. Now, does he need congressional approval there? It almost doesn't matter with this Congress, but he doesn't
need congressional approval on the firing end. He needs senatorial confirmation to appoint a new one.
That's truly spooky because, as you point out, I mean, the New York, New Jersey region is tremendously influential. A couple of U.S. attorneys could make a big difference if he wants to get away with stuff. Right. And he wants his corporate friends to get away with stuff, including the banks and everything.
Right. There's another, the inspectors general that are in every cabinet department and many of the agencies. The president can also replace any of them. They need Senate confirmation, but he can fire people at will. He can fire the IRS commissioner at will. Yeah. And although the IRS commissioner has a fixed term, that's more of a guideline than it is a rule. The president can fire the IRS commissioner.
Okay, so another potential form of resistance is the corporate world. We've already seen the way he wants to push the corporate world around, like if you don't say nice things about me, I will say you're sending jobs abroad and so on, and he seems to be getting a little mileage out of that. Are you at all heartened by what seems to be a resistance, at least coming from Silicon Valley?
No, I think, to my mind, actually the most interesting thing that's happened in this world. I didn't want to say no to that, but was really striking an incident that happened on the day we're recording this. I don't know when it will go up. Was the president tweeted out something hostile about Nordstrom's, and Nordstrom's stock went up. The reason that Twitter tool is so powerful is you can knock $1 billion off the valuation of a Boeing or a Ford. But Nordstrom, which is a customer-facing company, which had dropped Ivanka Trump's line for purely business reasons, it just wasn't selling. I know that I've got a lot of women and girls in my family, and they shop at Nordstrom's. And my wife and my youngest girl were at Nordstrom's soon after the election, buying teenage girl shoes, and Ivanka Trump shoes were there. And my wife picked up one of the shoes and said to the shoe salesman, "Do people say anything about this line?" And the salesman said, "No, they just don't buy it." And okay. You just don't buy it.
So it wasn't. You think it wasn't Nordstrom responding to the boycott? I mean, there was an emerging boycott, I think, right?
It's like that story. The shoe shop is a completely inchoate of people looking at it and saying, "Put it down. No, not for me." So when Trump attacked them, unlike what happened to Boeing, unlike what happened to Ford, their stock went up. Because Trader said, what's going to happen when the president attacks Nordstrom? People are going to come to the stores. I bought some socks that day. And I think other people, I'd been needing socks for a while. I hadn't done anything about it. And, okay, Nordstrom.com, let's get some socks. And other people did similar kinds of things. That is a sign that weapon may have, if that weapon doesn't instantly introduce fear, it may be knocked out of his hand.
Mm-hmm. Of course, some companies he has more leverage over than others, as you point out, I think, in the piece. I mean, certainly
consumer-facing companies are less vulnerable government contractors. This is one of the reasons I'm nervous about the Silicon Valley people. They depend a lot more on government contracts than in their libertarian ideology they like to acknowledge.
Yeah. Now another possible source of resistance is the press, and you allude in the opening of your piece, you're doing some like imagine America in the future, and things have gone awry thanks to Trump, and one of the things that's happened is he has, I think one of the examples is Amazon, rather than get blowback from Trump, has just let go of the Washington Post, which conveniently was bought by some Trump ally. Look,
I'm not just pulling these things out of thin air. Right now, CNN is at the center of a merger request by Time Warner and AT&T. And Trump has taken a negative line on this merger. And he has a lot of say over it. It's really valuable to AT&T and Time Warner. And it will be communicated that better treatment by CNN could help. And that's going to have an impact. CNN is already, although their news coverage has been pretty Trump skeptical, their commentary is very Trump positive, and that can all be adjusted. Here's a real world story, actually. So let's not talk about hypotheticals. Let's talk about something that's actually happened. If you think, I say the media, you think of the New York Times and the Washington Post. I think you're sort of missing the point. The largest, most important media company in America is Facebook. Reddit may be second or third most important. Twitter, fifth or sixth. About 2 weeks before the election, Twitter delisted a bunch of white nationalist accounts, individuals, and publications. Now, maybe let's leave to the side whether they should have done that or not. It's clearly they are entitled to do it if they want to. They're not bound by the First Amendment. Then Trump wins the election, and he convenes a meeting of Silicon Valley executives, and Twitter, his favorite company, is pointedly excluded. And that's not just because they were too small, as he said. I knew, I'd spoken to people in the Trump campaign, they were enraged at the dropping of these accounts. The day before the meeting, Twitter reinstates all of those accounts and verifies them. Now, if there was a pro-Trump columnist at the Washington Post and the Washington Post fired him and Donald Trump put pressure on the Washington Post to reinstate that columnist, we would know what that is. But we're not used to thinking of Twitter as that kind of company. And yet Trump got Twitter columnists reinstated and at a higher level of prestige, and they are now, they have many tens of thousands of followers, and they're verified, and they have more clout. And that was done through presidential disapproval.
Mm-hmm. Erdogan, with a lot of this stuff, Erdogan in Turkey comes to mind. And in the early days, back before he was just marching in and taking over, sending the troops into media companies, basically, he was using the fact that they are often part of corporate conglomerates, and one part of the corporation, it's like the AT&T thing you mentioned, and so there is precedent for this.
It's happening in Hungary. Erdogan, I should say, is too dramatic. But Hungary is the president. Hungary does this all the time. And again, they don't arrest people. They don't beat people up. No, they certainly don't kill people. But they have been able, one by one, through pressure on upstream corporations, to shut down independent media. Mm-hmm. And Freedom House now lists Hungary's press as semi-free rather than free. The only NATO country, I think, with the semi-free press, other than Turkey and
You mentioned Fox as a obviously relevant media company that is clearly waving the Trump banner. And you talked about as it being part of a larger edifice that involves supporting think tanks and so on. I'm curious, is it clear yet how the think tank thing is shaking out? Are there any conservative think tanks aside from Cato, predictably, that clearly have joined the resistance?
No.
Not a one.
Look, I was at an event in London during the election when it didn't look like Trump would even win the nomination at that point. And the head of the Heritage Foundation was there and talking about how I was there as a guest, so I'll try to. I don't want to disclose his private conversations, but what he's intimating is that whatever he personally may or may not have felt about Donald Trump, that Heritage was there to help whoever the Republican nominee was, and everybody had better get used to that idea. Heritage has made its peace with Trump. AEI has been a little bit more cautious, but basically, yes, them too. They're in the job of raising money by showing influence on the administration. And without the influence, they don't raise the money. Without the money, they, They don't need.
So no hope there. What? Let's try to sketch a hopeful scenario.
I can sketch up hopeful scenarios. That's not hard either.
Go ahead.
Okay. The hopeful scenarios are there are a lot of defections of Republican donors and voters in the country get increasingly uneasy. Trump's numbers deteriorate. Members of Congress begin to see his interests as departing from theirs. As that situation deteriorates, a number of the senators he's insulted or offended remember that he's insulted or offended them. And they then become more receptive to various forms of investigation, which you don't think like a Republican, and why should you? But for Republicans, the Russia thing is the most upsetting thing of them all.
A lot of liberals have warmed up to that, too. I'm not exactly in their wavelength, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is, look, I say to all my Hillary Clinton voting friends that this is where you discovered the neocon critique of Obama was right. He was weak on Russia. And the wheels gradually come off the bus. And what also happens larger in the country is, a lot of people say, I'm going to spend a little less time watching the Kardashians and a little bit more time reading Reuters. I'm not just going to go to that rally, but I'm actually going to come and knock on doors for candidates that I think about. For all this anxiety about Citizens United, whether you think it's a good decision or bad, the evidence is pretty clear that nothing is more powerful than a neighbor knocking on your door. If you can have neighbors knocking on your door and the other guy's got hundreds of millions of dollars, you're going to win. That's the most powerful thing. And people say, I'm going to stop forwarding this amusing email of this allegation until I've independently verified that I personally know that it's true. Because it's now not being published upstream, it's being published by me. I'm not going to publish it unless I'm sure it's true.
That is asking a lot, I got to say. Because, this is just...
it's not. It's 2.5 minutes. I used to get these emails about how Barack Obama was no longer sending American flags to drape the coffins of veterans. That is a story that you can debunk with one Google search. It's really...
Right. What I mean is, it depends on whether you're saying, former Trump supporters who have turned against him will now evaluate these stories. That's one thing. But if you're asking everyone to carefully evaluate even the stories that seem to support their ideological predisposition, I do think that's what needs to happen. I just think it's a very stubborn problem of human psychology because of how naturally tribalistic we are, is all I'm saying.
Yes, that's all true, but you don't have to go. You just have to be a little bit better. Just be a little better. You don't have to be a lot better. You don't have to be non-human. You don't have to be a hero. Just be a little better than you were before.
Right, I agree. And I agree with, I think, the larger point implicit here, which is that fundamentally, leave aside Trump. Just back when I was thinking about the problem of polarization in America and sectarian conflict abroad and all forms of tribalism, my view was it's not just like, there's not going to be like a policy solution per se. People are going to have to do at least some kind of incremental transcendence, above their ordinary proclivities. And they don't have to become saints.
Okay, then let me end here. This is a good, because I want to end with a hard teaching for you, because we've been agreeing too much. Because one of the other things that is going to happen here, I believe, and you won't like this, we have to rediscover the lessons of 1848. And liberalism, in the broadest sense of the word, is absolutely connected to nationalism. That you cannot have liberalism without borders. And because people will not be loyal. When you ask people to be loyal to humanity, they will revert to tribe. And the nation is as big as we are going to get as people. Being an American is already such a global identity. And what Merkel did with the Syrian migrants, or the so-called Syrian migrants in 2015, what has happened with the collapse of borders, that this is one of the crucial enablers of this new populist authoritarianism. And so one of my pleas to liberals like you is you have to rediscover, when you ask people to be bigger than the nation, they're just going to become smaller than the nation.
Actually, that might be an improvement, but let me just say that, I'm not asking people to entirely abandon national allegiance. I do think a couple of related things. One is the world will not survive in a form that any of us would welcome if we don't recognize that nations are going to have to cooperate in newly institutionalized form. I was just shoveling snow. I met my next door neighbor who's a graduate student who at the Wilson School at Princeton is working on the problem of controlling biological weapons. And he was talking about what a difficult engineering challenge it is. He's an actual engineer. The verification of on any biological weapons treaty. And I said, wow. And just the scary thing is how far we are from politically from being able to, it doesn't matter what you guys cook up at the Wilson School. We are nowhere near ready to take that seriously given current politics. So one thing I'd say is we have to take seriously certain forms of global governance. My view is if we want the planet to, at the risk of over-dramatizing this, at least survive in any kind of form, we'd welcome. Now that said, you can certainly, national identity can remain a thing. I do think that to some extent the evolution of global governance probably needs to involve people deepening their appreciation of their membership in the human tribe and perhaps giving that somewhat higher priority than it had before relative to their national allegiance. But I'm not calling for the dissolution of national borders. We need units, conglomerations need units that constitute them. Nations are the ones we have. Fine.
If Angela Merkel had said no in the summer of 2015 to that influx that purported to be from Syria, but was really from the whole planet, I don't think Donald Trump would be president today. I don't think Britain would have voted to leave the European Union. I don't think we'd be contending with the risk of fascist takeovers in France and the Netherlands, and I think that Germany's democracy would be stronger. You are an exponent of the biological basis of the human mind. These things are real, and the attempt to, they're arbitrary. They're both real and they're both arbitrary. And the fact that they are so arbitrary should not blind us to how real they are.
Yeah, but I'm not an open borders absolutist. I would have advised her to be a little more moderate, and I'm not against enforcing our immigration laws on the southern border. I think a wall is a needlessly ugly way to do it, but I'm not against that. I am against rounding up people who have been here for a long time and so on. But I'm not. You shouldn't infer too much about my views on a whole bunch of things based on my commitment to global governance.
And I'm just relying on what Mickey Cow's telling me about you.
What's that?
I'm relying on what Mickey tells me about you.
Oh, well, please don't do that. God only knows. I think we definitely have to end the recording here if the alternative is to get into things Mickey has said about me. But David, thank you so much. Again, the piece is in the Atlantic. You end on a note of hope, so people should read till the end and be inspired and not just depressed as the first 90% of it will leave them.
70%. It's
75. Okay. Well,
right,
thank you, David.
Bye-bye.